They were promised light and buried beneath silence. The chapel sits untouched, its doors sealed with scripture, not by faith, but by fear. 50 voices once echoed prayers inside. Now, only one remains. And it's not human. In a village erased from maps, one chapel consumed its congregation, one prayer at a time. The trees in eastern Tennessee don't part easily, especially not for strangers. But in October of 1841, they did. Locals remember the mist that rolled in that week too early for the season. It clung to the bark like breath on glass. You could walk just 20 feet into the woods and vanish completely. But the silence was the strangest part, not the absence of birds, but of everything. No rustling leaves, no distant howls, just quiet. And then they arrived. They came on foot, 14 men, 5 women, all pale, all wearing rough-spun wool garments identical in cut and color. They said nothing to the villagers, only nodded when met at the road. Their accent was thick, possibly Slavic, but no one could quite place it. They were missionaries. They said carriers of something, sacred what they carried. No one ever saw, only a wooden box bound in iron bands, carried by 2 men who never let it touch the ground, even when they slept. They held it between them, and the site had already been chosen. They didn't ask permission. They moved through the woods like they'd been there before, like the trees remembered them. One local boy, 11 at the time, swore he saw the tallest missionary, an older man with deep-set eyes, place his hand against a birch tree and whisper something. The tree leaned away that night. The singing began. No hammers, no saws, no carts of lumber, brought in just voices, low, monotone. Some said it sounded like Gregorian chant. Others called it something darker, like a hum that came from the earth itself, and not from their throats. By dawn, the chapel was standing wooden, small, hexagonal in shape. It sat at the edge of a clearing that had not existed the day before. Bark on the nearby trees was scorched in a perfect radius. No signs of fire, just the blackened edges of something. Repelled, no nails had been used, no seams in the wood. The door had no handle, only a single carved line, shaped like a fish with one eye, and they never left it. Not for meals, not for supplies, not even for water. They sang at dawn, they sang at noon, they sang at midnight, always the same. Hymn, no lyrics anyone could translate, just sounds, mouths forming vowels. That didn't match the human palate. Locals began to stay away. The animals. 2 dogs refused to go near the chapel. Birds never perched on its roof. Even insects seemed to avoid it. One farmer, curious, brought a calf into the clearing on a leash. It froze, trembled, and died foaming at the mouth before it could take a step forward. He never came back, and still the missionaries sang by winter. Villagers stopped mentioning them. The chapel became a feature of the land, like a boulder or a cave or a sickness you learn to live around. But in January, a letter arrived, written in perfect English, signed only Brother Iosif. It invited the villagers to witness a consecration. No one accepted, but 2 young men from the next town, over-skeptical and eager, went anyway. They never returned. Their horses were found 3 days later, tied to a dead tree, with mouths sewn shut. A week passed, then 2, and then the singing stopped for 1 full day, and then resumed, faster, louder, still in that impossible language. But something was different now. People said they felt it when the wind shifted, the sense that the land itself was listening, that something had been placed in its belly, and it had not digested it. And the chapel began to age too quickly. By spring, moss had overtaken one wall entirely. The wood grew gray, slats warped, paint peeled that no one had seen applied. The building creaked in the wind, but never moved, and no one ever saw the missionaries again. Some claimed they saw figures in the windows, pale outlines, faces pressed too close to the glass, but when they approached, there was no window, only wood, seamless, unbroken. In 1843, a local pastor was dared to spend the night outside the chapel. He brought a Bible, a lantern, and a rifle. He returned the next morning, but wouldn't speak. He locked himself in his house for 4 days. In the 5th, he walked out into the woods and dug a pit. He buried his Bible in it. Then quietly, he walked into the river. They never found his body, but the chapel remained, and every so often, on fog-heavy mornings, the mist would clear for just a moment, and a new carving would appear on the chapel door, a symbol no one recognized except the oldest woman in town, who hadn't spoken in decades. She pointed at it and whispered, "That wasn't there before." She died later that night, smiling. The first Mass was held on a Thursday. No one had been invited, but just before dawn, the bell rang once, cutting through the fog like a blade. No one had ever seen a bell installed. No rope, no tower, just the sound. A farmer named John. Eli was tending his goats when he heard it. He thought it might have been thunder, distant and dry, but the sky was clear, and the goats were gone. He found them scattered across the field, not mauled, not butchered, just still, their eyes wide, their bodies intact, every rib accounted for, no blood, just silence. He never returned to that field. In the town's only schoolhouse, the children stopped speaking one by one. In the middle of morning lessons, they fell quiet, not out of mischief, not out of fear, just quiet. Their lips moved, their eyes followed the chalk on the blackboard. But no sound came. The teacher thought it might be a prank, till one of the girls began to cry. Her mouth opened, but the sobs were dry. Her throat worked, but no breath came out. The physician called it hysteria. He was wrong. That night, the chapel bell rang again 3 times, even though no one had entered the building in weeks. Even though the door had no handle. By the following Sunday, the cattle wouldn't feed the hens. Laid shells, empty, perfect eggs, no yolk, no fluid, just dust. One of the older women, Miriam Dre, swore she saw the ground shift outside her house, as if something underneath had stretched and settled again, like lungs trying to breathe. But when her son dug, there was nothing, just soil, dry but cold. And then came the voice, not loud, not even clear, just heard inside. It happened while people slept, while they stirred, while they dreamt of things they couldn't remember. By morning, a phrase, spoken in a language no one knew, but everyone understood it, came with the same rhythm, 5 words, each syllable pulled like thread, and it came after the bell. The old pastor from the next town over, Father Green, was asked to intervene. Reluctantly, he agreed. He arrived with scripture, a flask of water, 2 acolytes. They didn't make it to the chapel. The carriage horses bucked when they reached the Trilineon, collapsed in the harness. The other broke free, kicking until its hooves shattered. Against the rocks, Father Green never touched the chapel walls. He stood just outside the clearing, looked once, and whispered, "They're praying, but not to God." He didn't stay the night. No one did that winter. The deaths increased first. It was animals. And the fever, no boil, no rash, just heat, and then cold, and then nothing. Miriam Dre was found kneeling in her bedroom, hands folded, eyes open, frozen. She looked peaceful until someone noticed her tongue was missing. It hadn't been cut. It had never formed, as if it had been prayed away. The children still wouldn't speak, but one of them, Peter Lang, began to draw. He was 6, had never held a pencil before, but his father found him one night, sitting by the hearth, sketching in the ash. Hyrule's wheels, not symbols, not quite, more like instructions, repetitive, mechanical, almost architectural. When asked, he only smiled, and the bell rang 12 times, even though the clock tower in town had long been broken, even though the chapel had no clock at all. Some started calling it the Mass bell, others called it the counting, no matter what time of day it struck. Someone died, not always violently, not always visibly, but always. The blacksmith's wife miscarried during a noontide toll. The schoolteacher, silent for weeks, walked into the woods during the midnight chime. They found her shoes, nothing else. And the prayers continued. No one ever heard them with ears, but people began to repeat them in sleep, in murmurs, in scribbles. A woman named Carol Withers filled 8 pages with unfamiliar text letters that curled and bled into one another. She had never learned to write, and no one could translate it. But when she read it aloud, every window in her house cracked inward. She never spoke again, and the chapel bell rang 14 times, even when the wind was still, even when no one was near it. No mechanism was ever found. Wooden walls had no scenes, no belfry, no rope, but always the sound. One man, Tom Weatherby, swore he'd seen inside, said the doors opened for him, that he didn't touch them. They just breathed apart. He said the floor was dirt, but soft alive. Somehow that the altar was a stone, floating above a shadow. He described pews made of ash-stained glass windows that reflected nothing, and at the center, just air, not emptiness, but something waiting to be filled. He left town a week later. No one ever saw him again, but the chapel remained, and the bell kept ringing at odd hours, with no pattern. Each told a fracture in the silence, and somewhere beneath it all, a whisper that grew more familiar. One phrase, spoken in sleep, heard by children and carved by trembling hands: the ground has agreed. And the door was beginning to open. The garden was never meant to grow. It sat behind the chapel, hemmed in by trees that leaned away from the clearing. The soil was dark and packed like stone. No one ever tilled it. No one planted seeds. Things grew there anyway, thick-stemmed vines that twisted together without blooming leaves, the color of bruised skin, a kind of root that curled above the surface like fingers reaching up, and always the scent sweet, heavy, thick like syrup in the lungs. This villagers said it wasn't natural. They said it started the day she appeared. No one saw her arrive. She was simply there one morning, kneeling in the center of the garden, beneath a warped iron cross, pale skin, downcast eyes, her hands folded so tightly the knuckles had gone blue. Her robes were white, not stitched, not sewn, just draped, like cloth shaped around her by heat, and she was praying, mouth-moving words. Inaudible, but the cadence was unmistakable, the rhythm of ritual. She did not speak to anyone, did not eat, did not sleep. She only knelt and prayed. A bowl of incense rested before her. It burned without smoke, no ember, just the scent, that heavy, narcotic sweetness. People began to notice her. After the third dia, child saw her first through the trees, said she looked like a statue, except her lips kept moving. Others came and watched from the edge of the clearing. No one approached, not out of fear but reverence. She looked sacred, even if no one could say why. One man, a carpenter, tried to offer her water. He set the jar beside her gently, careful not to disturb the bowl. The next morning, the jar was gone, and the man found his hands blistered, not burned, just swollen as if pressed against something pulsing and wrong. He wouldn't speak after that, not about her, not about the chapel. By the end of the week, her robes had darkened, still white, but tinted now with gray. Around the hems, ash clung to the fabric, not fallen from the sky, but rising from the folds themselves. It looked like smoke trapped in cotton, and still she prayed. The incense never ran out. Her face never changed. It was peaceful too, peaceful. A local woman, Ruth, said it looked like someone who'd already died and was being remembered. Some thought she was a nun, others thought she was a penitent, but no one asked, because no one wanted to be near her for too long. The longer you watched, the heavier you felt, as if gravity had thickened, as if her words unheard were pressing on your bones. Boy vomited after watching her for more than 10 minutes. He said her eyes weren't moving, but her reflection in the bowl was. He never went back. Neither did the priest. Father Meldon had come from 4 towns over, sent by the diocese to observe the property. He lasted 2 hours, was seen entering the chapel with a crucifix. He exited white-faced, said nothing. He removed his collar that night, wrote a letter. No one was ever allowed to read. The envelope had only 4 words on the front: she's not praying to him. The garden grew denser, not with life, but with presence. The vines began to bend toward her, not wrap, not entangle, just lean. The iron cross behind her, darkened spots appeared like rot, and birds stopped flying overhead. Ash spread further by the second week. Her entire robe was gray by the third, nearly black, but she had not moved, not once. A man from the edge of town, skeptical, walked a circle around the clearing, kept his distance. He said the wind moved differently near her, that the trees swayed, even when the air was still. He took a photograph, old lens glass plate. It developed wrong, too dark, The trees showed the chapel behind her showed, but where she knelt, the image was burned clean white as bone, and the incense bowl was gone. He never took another photo, and still, she prayed, and the robe once cloth began to crumble like paper, like something dry and centuries old. But no part of her skin showed, only more ash by the 6th week. She was entirely gray, and the praying slowed her. Her lips moved less, but her head tilted slightly toward the chapel, and then the incense returned unlit, unsmoked just there again, in the bowl, as if nothing had changed. Same sweet smell now, thicker bitter at the edges. It clung to close, to memory, to sleep. One woman said she couldn't dream anymore, only remembered the scent and the sound of something kneeling behind her. Ash began to lift gently, barely perceptible, just the smallest drift. Whenever the wind moved, and with it something else here, shimmer not visible, felt like heat above asphalt or breath in cold air. Only for a second, then gone. The chapel bell had been silent for days, but on the 43rd day, it rang once, not loud, low, almost apologetic, the kind of sound you'd expect beneath the earth, and she exhaled not deeply, just enough to move the ash, and her mouth stopped moving, just stillness, no collapse, no gesture, just still. But she didn't fall, she didn't sway, she didn't sink, she remained kneeling, and the robe, now brittle, began to flake. Fine gray dust caught in the air, something underneath, not bone, not skin, just the shape of a woman, continuing to pray, but not breathing and not there. The incense never ran out, the bowl never cooled, and no one ever touched her, not again. But one boy, years later, walking near the tree line, swore he saw something move, not her, but her shadow facing away and kneeling in the wrong direction. The trees swayed without wind that morning, soft, rhythmic, like they were listening to something not far from the overgrown path. A man named Callum Dresner wiped the sweat from his collar and steadied his horse. He was 2 days off course, headed east with no real reason, carrying only a satchel and a quiet sense of urgency. Locals later said he shouldn't have taken that road, but he was new to Tennessee and didn't yet know what roads weren't marked on maps for a reason. He heard it first as a shimmer, something between sound and air, then, unmistakably, music. He slowed the horse, strained to listen, voices, dozens of them stacked in harmony, moving with perfect timing. But the words, they were wrong, Latin, yes, but reversed, not slurred or stuttered, precisely backward, as if unspooled from memory. And it wasn't one melody, it was 3 layered, each one climbing in opposite directions, one ascending, one descending, one holding. He dismounted. The trees pulsed with it, not in volume, nothing ever got loud, but the texture of the air changed, like singing underwater. His horse refused to move further. It trembled, then bolted. Callum didn't chase either, couldn't, as that's when he saw the chapel rising between trees that shouldn't have allowed for its shape-warped roofline. No windows, wood as gray as unturned soil, and no visible doors, just walls weathered smooth, like something had been brushing them for years. The sound was louder now, but only inside his skull, not in his ears. Stepped closer and felt the first vibration in the soles of his feet, a low hum, matching the rhythm of the inverted chant. His breath caught. He said later he felt like he was being sung into, not watched, not followed, but open. The music didn't come from the chapel, it came from the space around it, like the trees were echoing something they shouldn't have heard. He didn't see anyone, no people, no faces, no bodies, but the choir never missed a note, and that was the worst part. No human group sings like that. There are flaws, delays, breaths. This choir didn't breathe, it pulsed. Callum said he turned to leave, but the music kept following even as he backed away. It pressed against his spine. The further he walked, the clearer it became, as if the chapel didn't want him close, it wanted him to carry Ive. Walked for 3 miles before the sound faded, not stopped, just receded, and when it did, he vomited. No sickness, no pain, just purging of something that had entered too deep. When he returned to town, he wouldn't speak for 3 days. He covered his ears when church bells rang. He flinched when children sang, and when asked to describe the melody, he wept, but others heard it too. 2 hunters camping near the ridge a week later. Returned pale and silent, one wouldn't remove his hat indoors. The other covered every mirror in his home. They never explained why, but one left a note written backwards for lines. The mouths don't open. The notes aren't sung. The voices are old, and they're still learning by the fall. More travelers passed through the area. Some spoke of a singing fog that hovered low and curled through the trees like incense. Others said their names were called in dreams. They never remembered, but the number kept growing. 50. That was the count by winter. 50 people who had gone to the chapel returned. Not bodies, not belongings, just gone. But the music changed. Witnesses said the harmonies thickened, lower tones joined, deep subterranean more than 50 now, and yet there was no choir, no pews inside, no organ, no music stand, just an open room with a dirt floor and a shadow on the ceiling. That pulsed. One woman, a nurse named Helene Fry, said she stood outside the chapel at dusk and swore she saw movement in the cracks of the wood. Not figures, not shapes, just vibration like light. Pressed into meat. She left town the next day, but she mailed a recording. First day, wax cylinder sealed in wax unlabeled. Town doctor played it once, then burned it and hung a sign on his door. No music. He died 3 weeks later, collapsed in the sanctuary. Of his church, mouth open, ears bleeding, and a single phrase carved into the pew beside him backward et sonus venit retro, and the sound came back to this day. No one knows how the music was made, no mechanism, no people, no choir, just the impossible blend of voices. And each year, on the same week, Callum Dresner passed through. Someone hears it again, never loud, always precise, a song that shouldn't exist, that sounds less like worship and more like practice, and each time there's a new voice in the harmony, one no one recognizes, but always sung in reverse. The ink had faded almost completely. Pale strokes, uneven lines, letters that looked less written and more exhaled. They were found in a rusted lockbox beneath the floor, a shuttered parish house. 5 yellowing envelopes. No stamps, no dates, just the word Confessio written on each flap in trembling hand. The house itself had been untouched. Since 1902, no one remembered who had lived there, only that it had been affiliated with the mission. The one near the woods, the one no one mentioned anymore. The first letter was almost ordinary, a neat salutation. Dear brothers. It began. The priest's name was Father Alwyn Mark, a Czech-born missionary, sent to the Tennessee hills in 1898. He was supposed to oversee the remains of the chapel to ensure no further pilgrims returned, but the letter did not speak of repair or closure or peace. It spoke of sound. The grounds hum. He wrote, even when the air is still, I can feel it through the soles of my shoes. It doesn't stop at night. He wrote of faint rhythms in the garden, of voices that weren't voices, more like intonations, the shape of words, but not their meaning. And most of all, he wrote of a presence not watching, not hovering, but resting, like something has settled beneath the floor of the chapel. He said, and does not wish to be disturbed, but we are disturbing it anyway. The second letter came days or weeks later. It had no date, but the tone was different, less formal, shorter sentences, more crossings out. The handwriting was slightly changed, still legible, but off. I've asked the others to stop singing. It's not praise anymore. I don't know what it is. He mentioned 3 other acolytes, none by name, just initials CM and RR. Speaks in sleep now. He wrote, his voice isn't his own. It's higher and sometimes echoes, even when the room is still. C has begun kneeling in the garden beside the ash. She won't look up. The third letter was almost unreadable. The lines had slipped from left to right, diagonal strokes, like he'd written in a hurry, or, while shaking in the words, they'd begun to blur, not smeared. Transformed. Certain letters were no longer from the Roman alphabet. They looped, curled, split like branches. It's not prayer anymore. He wrote, it's listening. We thought we were directing it, that it needed our voices, but it never did. He described a night when the bells rang without motion, no sway, no wind, just sound and a voice inside the chapel. Not loud, but layered, repeating. something none of them could recall. You don't remember it. He wrote, but your body does. The fourth letter was worse. Most of it was written in complete symbols, curved sigils. Repeating, he had begun drawing in circles. The words orbited one another in the margins. He'd written in tiny, crumbed lines. They sing without tongues, now I've seen it. Walked into the forest. His body stayed, but his shadow didn't. I no longer opened my eyes during Mass. The paper itself was brittle flakes of gray around the edges as if it had been handled too many times by hands that had forgotten how to hold. And then came the fifth one-line, single sentence written in red ink or something like it. The letters curved gently, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. We're not worshiping anymore. We're listening. And it's still speaking. There was no signature, just a small stain at the bottom knot. A fingerprint, not a seal, just pressure, as if the writer had pressed the page down. And waited. The chapel, when searched in 1902, was empty. No priest, no acolytes, but marks were found in the dirt, dozens of them, circular like knees that had knelt too, longsome, still warm and on the altar. If it could still be called that, was a single page blank, but if you tilted it in the light, you could see faint grooves as if a hand had hovered just above it, writing something. That hadn't stopped yet. The grass never grew flat in the chapel's burial yard. Even after the rain, even after snow, each mound held its shape. A little too firm, a little too raised, like something underneath was resisting the weight. The first 20 by autumn, mostly acolytes, some pilgrims, one local woman who refused to leave the garden's edge. Father Mark performed rites over each grave, simple, soft, and urgent. He didn't chant, he whispered. By then, the bishop had stopped. Responding letters returned unopened, requests ignored. The chapel had already been condemned once, but no one had followed through, or the priest kept burying them. By the time the frost came, the count had reached 50 marked with simple crosses, some wood, some just stone. But that's when the ground started changing. It began with scent. The soil, always damp and moss-covered, turned bitter like iron and rot, but too clean, not decay, more like preservation gone wrong. The air grew warmer around the burial site, even when snow fell elsewhere in the valley. It melted instantly along the graves. Then came the sound just after dusk, barely audibly low hum, no pitch, no melody, but felt in the teeth, in the soles of the feet, behind the eyes. The first grave reopened on December 9, no tools, no footprints, just earth, peeled back as if unwrapped. The body inside hadn't decomposed. No insects, no bloating, no smell, just skin, pale and still, like wax left too close to the fire. His name had been Elijah, acolyte, 20 years old. The priest reburied him double depth, more prayer. By morning, it was open again, and so was the one beside it. Within a week, 27 graves had opened. The rest, still sealed for now, but the humming grew louder. Visitors began to feel it before they saw the chapel. One man lost a tooth just by stepping onto the hill. He said it felt like pressure, like something pulling inside his jaw. Father Marek begged the diocese for help. He wrote 3 final letters. They are not at rest. The ground won't take them. I believe we are being rejected. He requested a full re-sanctification. Holy oil, 3 priests. A formal mass the bishop refused officially. There was no chapel, no mission, no congregation. They had been written off, erased, and the graves kept opening, but not randomly in sequence, as if by order. Acolytes first, then the converts, then the last pilgrim. A woman whose name no one had recorded, her grave was the only one that didn't fully open. Instead, the earth around it began to pulse, not shake, not collapse, just rise, then sink like breath. The humming deepened. What had been barely noticeable now rippled, and the glass lamps flickered. Nails curled in the walls, and the bodies, the ones uncovered, began to change, not decay, but stiffen, not from rigor, not from time, from something else. Each had their mouths slightly open. Each had dirt beneath their nails. Each was facing the chapel. One girl who hadn't spoken since her brother's burial stood by the graveyard one night. She didn't cry, didn't speak, But when her father found her the next morning, she had drawn something in the frost. Not a symbol, not a word a mouth. Wide black repeating father. Marek began sleeping in the sacristy. He wouldn't go near the yard after dark. He stopped ringing the bell. He stopped saying Massy. Only listened. He said it came louder at night, that the ground beneath the chapel had tones like choral notes, but off-stretched and always just beneath hearing, he believed. It was the land itself, rejecting them, not for sin, not for blasphemy, but for interruption. He began to speak of trespass, not the human kind, the architectural kind, that the building was wrong. Too heavy, too straight, too much language. Pressed into something that never wanted to speak. The last entry in his journal was dated February 3 RD. The ink was shaky. The pen strokes shallow, just one phrase. It won't bury what it never asked for. Then nothing. The chapel stood silent for weeks. The graves stayed open until one night, during a thunderless storm, the air split, not lightning, not fire, just a sound like stone breaking underwater, and the remaining graves, close, not filled, not sealed, just gone. The markers remained, but the soil was level, no sign of movement, no bodies, no bones, only that bitter warmth and the hum. That now came from inside the chapel itself, low, constant, like something alive. And listening, the road to the chapel had vanished, not washed away, not overgrown, just absent, as if the land had folded it. In the team of theologians arrived in late March 1938, 3 men, 2 women all, sanctioned by the Archdiocese of St. Louis, accompanied by a single civil engineer. They were tasked not with restoring, but verifying to determine whether the structure still qualified as holy ground, or whether it had become something else entirely. The woods were denser than the records described. The path that once led to the mission hill was impassable. Vines that clung like veinso. They hiked in on foot, cutting through underbrush that bent away, then seemed to bend back once they passed by the second day. They found it still standing, still gray, still silent, but different. The walls no longer bore signs of rot or collapse. The roof, though sagging, hadn't fallen, and the door, what had once been sealed, stood open, not wide, just enough to suggest invitation. Father Keen, the eldest among them, paused before entering. He said the air felt compressed, like stepping into a room that had just stopped breathing inside. The temperature dropped by at least 15 degrees, but the wood wasn't cold. It was warm, slightly damp, as if touched by something that had hands, but not heat. The chapel's interior had no pews, just dust, and a single altar, pushed back against the far wall, rectangular, carved from a stone not native to Tennessee. It looked folded as if it had once been molten, then pressed flat beneath it. Something shimmered, not visibly, just at the edges of attention. The floorboards beneath had been removed, revealing stone, not brick, not tile, but unbroken, solid stone, and on its surface symbols not etched, carved deep. Violent theologian Ellen Whitker recognized 3 immediately: a Greek Christogram, a Zoroastrian Faravar, and a Hebraic character chet, a letter used in ancient priestly seals. The 4th took longer, a Janist wheel. Incompleted spokes snapped in the carving, like someone had tried to halt the motion. But the 5th, no one could place a jagged spiral, inverted, etched so deep it had reached the marrow of the stone, and from its center, a dark liquid, slow, still, wet, no smell, but thick like blood. After too many days sealed in heat, they touched nothing. No photographs were taken. They only copied the markings by hand. But when Ellen tried to trace the spiral, her pencil snapped, not from pressure, from resistance, as if the paper had stiffened in that one spot. They held a brief prayer, silent, each one bowed, but only 4 heads rose again. The 5th father, Corinne, remained still, eyes closed, mouth open. He began whispering, not English, not Latin, something else. They said. It sounded curved, not like language, like something being remembered. They led him outside. He vomited soil-thick clumps, still damp. He was taken back to camp and sedated, but he didn't sleep. His eyes fluttered, not in pain, in rhythm, like blinking to a beat. Only he could hear that night The humming returned low-grounded, almost. Patient, the stone beneath the altar vibrated. They didn't touch it, but they recorded it. The engineer, Thomas Ray, used a tuning fork. Jumped in his hand before contact day resonance at 53 Hz, the same frequency. Used in sonar, he refused to stay another night. Left at first light, but before leaving, he warned, "This isn't a structure, it's a seal. It's not keeping something out, it's keeping something in." Ellen's final notes, written hastily and unevenly, said she believed the spiral wasn't a simulate, was a map, but not to a location, to a sentence, a phrase. If followed long enough, that looped, and each time it looped, something listened, and something responded. The blood, if it was blood, never dried. It remained warm, pulsing, not visibly, but when touched with cloth, the fibers curled. The team left on the 5th day. They sealed the chapel door, marked it with white chalk, and left a single note nailed outside. "Do not enter. The prayer has been answered," and it did not like what it heard. The chapel was declared a non-site. Its coordinates, remove no rites, were performed. The archdiocese declared it an unresolved ambiguity. But the humming has been recorded 6 times since then, always in spring, always near soil, and always close to where the seal had been. But that's not what disturbs theologians. Most it's what they found weeks later back in St. Louis among Ellen's journals. A final page folded once, no words, just a spiral drawn in her hand, but no ink only. Blood still wet, still warm, and still curling as if finishing itself. The trees around the chapel didn't sway. They held still like they were listening. The year was 1973, and something had brought Randall Pierce back. He was 31, quiet-lived, alone outside of Asheville. He never called it escaping. He called it surviving. But only once after that. He never said the word again. Randall had arrived at the chapel with 49 others. He didn't know all their names. Some were clergy. Some wore hospital scrubs. Another wore no shoes. They met at a train station. No one told them how. They knew to go. Just an address, a time, and a phrase. "We've reached 49. We need the 51st. The walk to the chapel was silent, not by instruction. Just agreement. Randall remembered the smell, like wet linen, like old pages, like something underground had been disturbed when they arrived. No one touched the door. It opened on its own. There was no wind, no hinges creaked. It just widened. The interior was dark, but not pitch-soft gray. Light filtered in through slats in the roof. 50 of them entered. In a line, no one shuffled, no one turned. Inside, no pews. No altar, only a circle not marked. Not drawn, but visible in the way dust refused to settle therein. The way the floorboards hummed if you stood too close. They took positions evenly spaced, all except one. A space left empty, dead center. Randall stepped forward. He didn't know why. He said something in him had clicked, not like memory, like gravity. The others closed their eyes and began to speak, but not in unison, not like prayer. It was layered, tonal, not a chant, not a hymn, more like a map being read out loud. Each voice carried a different part, different direction, different language. Randall's mouth stayed closed. He couldn't move. He couldn't blink, but he heard all 50, and each word moved something in the air, not vibrated, bent like time, and softened. And sound was shaping it. They called each utterance a prayer, but they weren't aimed upward. They were drawn down, compressed, packed into the space between the floorboards, as if they were folding the room in on itself by the 48th prayer. The light had dimmed, even the gray was gone. The air grew heavy, viscous. He said it felt like trying to breathe through someone else's lungs. And then, the 49 Thay, woman, elderly, her eyes rolled back, her mouth opened too wide. The sound that came out was not hers. It wasn't anyone's. It wasn't sound. It was shape, a pressure in the skull, like something growing inward. Randall said he felt his own name leave him, not spoken. Removed. The 50th voice was silence. It didn't say anything, but the floor listened. Boards, curled, nails popped, and then the air shifted. Something was waiting. And that's when Randall understood this wasn't worship, it was containment. They weren't honoring something. They were binding it, each voice, each note, each breath, Part of the seal, the 50, were the congregation. They were a Locke and Randall. He was the final bolt, the 51SD. He said he saw it not clearly, just outlines, a shape. Beneath the floor, breathing not in rhythm, but in anticipation, and something cracked inside him. A single sound like a scream, from inside the teeth not out in the air screamed all of it, like the atmosphere had torn, and the chapel shook only. Once a pulse, everyone fell silent, their mouths still open, but their breath gone. Randall moved. He doesn't know how, he just remembers stumbling backward, crawling not out the door, but through the wall. The wood gave as if it let him go. He ran, his ears bled for 3 days. He couldn't hear music again for 5 years, and when he finally spoke, he said the 51st prayer had worked, but only partially. That the thing beneath them hadn't been trapped, just stalled, delayed. That part of it had stayed bound, but something else had followed him out. Randall died in 1986, heart failure, alone in a motel room. The coroner noted something strange. His vocal cords were missing, not cut, not torn, gone. The tissue around them had sealed naturally, as if they'd never been there. And on the wall, written in his own handwriting, it only needed 51, but now it remembers the sound. No one has found the chapel since, but recordings still surface, short clips, audio distortions, voices layered in impossible tones, and always 50, never more, never less, except once in 2014 a recording captured 51, but the last one wasn't a voice. It was breath, long, sharpened, coming from inside the microphone. Fog settles differently over that stretch of Tennessee. It doesn't roll, it waits. Satellite images show nothing, not a blur, not a shadow, just static, as if the land beneath the cloud cover doesn't exist at all. When you zoom in, the resolution breaks. The map corrects, GPS reroutes. No trailheads, no roads, no name. They used to call it Chapel Hill, now it's just unincorporated forest. But locals know, they won't say it, they won't point. But if you ask for directions to where the old mission once stood, they'll just go quiet, not afraid, not confused, just absent, like a piece of them forgets while you're asking, and then remembers just enough to walk away. But the hikers don't. They go every year, not many, just enough, and some come back not the same, but back. Jacob Trenner was one of them. 26, from Knoxville, hiked in with 2 friends. Late spring 2021, they followed a printed topographical map, found a narrow trail that wasn't on the GPSNO markers. No clearing, but something about the angle of the trees. Something led. Jacob said the deeper they walked, the quieter it became. Not silent, just filtered. Bird song faded, wind slowed, even footsteps dulled. He said it felt like wearing cotton in your ears, but only after you noticed it. They camped on the second night near a dry creek bed, uneventful still. But Jacob woke before dawn, chest tight, not choking, not asthma, just full. When he coughed, something came out, ash fine, cold like fireplace soot, but with no smell. His friends were gone, not missing, just not remembered. He said their names drifted. He could picture their faces. He could remember voices, but every time he tried to say the names aloud, his tongue. He walked back alone 14 hours straight. Didn't eat, didn't stop. When he reached the ranger station, he collapsed. They found his lungs were clear, but his breath tasted of smoke. Medical staff reported a faint hum in the stethoscope, as if the air in his chest was vibrating, but too slow to hear. They released him after 2 days. He doesn't go outside anymore, says he dreams of wood that remembers footsteps, of doors that don't open but wait, and of prayers not said aloud but whispered behind his eyes. He's not the only one. Since 2008, over a dozen hikers have reported symptoms, all different, but with one constant. They remember a voice that doesn't belong to them. Some say it's female, others childlike. It all agree it doesn't speak to them. It prays not in words and rhythm, a pulsing repetition, and always right behind the teeth. One man, 63, said he heard it through the ground, like a sermon being preached through stone. When he woke up, the soles of his feet were blistered, not burned, just worn, as if he'd walked miles barefoot, but had never left his tent. His hiking boots were still laced. His compass had bent, not broken, bent coiled like wire. Pointing in circles, rescue crews had been dispatched before drones malfunction, radios hiss. And maps, once marked, go blank within a mile, like the topography corrects itself. One ranger, speaking anonymously, said the chapel isn't gone. It's just folded, not invisible, just non-addressable, like trying to find a room in a house that doesn't want to be remembered. He believes it's not about hiding it. It's about consuming, that the chapel doesn't stand on the map anymore, because the map is inside it, as if every line drawn, every attempt to document, feeds it, gives it shape. Memory becomes structure. Structure becomes access. And when you step into that memory, even by accident, you give it one more brick. Jacob still wakes with ash on his pillow. The doctors say it's dust that old apartments have mold, but the particles don't match. They are finer, sharper. And when examined under light, they move. Just slightly, like breath held too long. Satellite data confirms the region remains unstable. Clouds gather in non-meteorological patterns. Shadows fall against the angle of the sun, and once, just once, a thermal scan revealed a temperature spike shaped like a door facing east, exactly where the chapel once stood. And just before the data was overwritten, a single word emerged in the feed, not text, not code, just a sequence drawn, like prayer, curved, like breath repeating and always pulsing, as if waiting to be said by someone who remembers how fog touches the ground like cloth, now heavy, hung low, as if something beneath it had exhaled and forgotten to inhale again. Hill where the chapel once stood has no path, no markers, no name, and if you reach the top, there is no door, just stone walls, worn smooth by hands that no longer exist, no windows, no roof, just scripture etched deeply, repeated endlessly, the same verse over and over, in Latin, in Aramaic, in something else, something angled you. Can't enter, but something can leave. Locals don't speak of the place, but they know the sound. It comes rarely, only on windless nights, when the moon is full but dim, when the dogs grow quiet, when the dirt feels too dry. It begins like pressure, then tone, then the bell. No one's seen it, not in photographs, not in person, but they've heard it, low iron rapte toll. Once, then again and again, never more than 52, never fewer than 50. The last toll is always slower, as if it's waiting for something or someone. The count matches the old records, 50 original prayers, one final seal, and now the next. Locals say the bell knows. It rings not for the dead, but for the ones about to remember. There was a woman, Sarah Glenn, who tried to record it, set up microphones near the hilltop in 1997. She left them for 3 nights. On the 4th, she returned to retrieve the tapes. The gear was gone, not stolen, just missing, except the stands, still upright, still facing the wall. She found one cassette jammed into dirt, bent, but not broken. When she played it back, there was no bell, just static, but underneath breathing, not human, not animal, breathing like stone, learning how to move. She played it once, then burned the tape. Said she never wanted to know what the next sound would have been. Sarah stopped speaking a year later. No trauma, no injury. She just forgot how her vocal cords fine, her brain intact, but words no longer arrived. Only silence, and on the wall of her home, etched in kitchen tile, was a sentence. It only needs one more. Nobody knows who it's waiting for, or what, but the toll still comes regular, measured some nights. It skips others. It repeats. There was a hiker just last spring who camped near the tree line. He never heard a bell, but he woke up sobbing. Couldn't he remember why? Said his dreams were filled with a voice, reciting prayers that didn't end up like loops, more like descents, each one deeper, harder, sharper, until words were no longer words, but weights. He left that morning, tried to write down what he heard, but his hand seized fingers. Curling backwards, the pen split, and he said between breaths that the bell had finally seen him. What does that mean? No one knows, but 6 months later, the bell rang 53 times, and silence, no toll, since not once, as if the number was fulfilled. But the wall, the stone wall with scripture, has changed. A new line has been carved, barely visible, but fresh. The stone lighter, and the etching still Rough, it's not in Latin, or any known tongue, but linguists say it's recursive, a phrase that, when read aloud, folds in on itself, rereads, recalls, re-invokes, not meaning presence. Some believe it's a call, others a seal, but one thing is clear: the chapel no longer takes visitors, keeps them not in body, in echo every word ever spoken inside, every chant, every scream, every whispered vow. It remembers, and sometimes, when the air stills, when the clouds don't move, you can feel it listening, not to judge, not to forgive, but to prepare, because even silence, especially silence, means something's about to speak. They built the chapel on unblessed land. They prayed without asking who might listen. 50 prayers, 50 disappearances. But it was never the number, it was the ritual. And now it waits again for the 52nd.